Morning, people. Every day I wonder why there aren't thousands of angry people surrounding Parliament at any given moment. Like, the way things are, I would expect fights to break out in news studios on a regular basis. Because the news that I'm about to discuss, A, proves that the government was elected on a plan that they know will drive millions of people deeper into poverty. B, proves the government is deliberately breaking their main election promise because they know that it would drive millions of people deeper into poverty. And C, if any Tory politician was ever properly confronted on this, they'd have nothing to defend themselves, and so they'd have to just start throwing punches in the studio. But here we are. The government is delaying the start of doing Brexit checks on imports from the EU for the 5th time because of the effect it would have on inflation. Because almost a third of the food that we eat in the UK comes from the EU, and now that food has to be checked because we're no longer under the same rules and regulations as the EU, which makes the whole process more expensive. But to be fair to the Tories, nobody could have predicted that. In unrelated news, here's me in early 2016, 7 years ago.
It means that if we leave, in terms of harmonization, we can either not follow the rules that the EU has set, in which case we'll become less attractive because companies in other countries will have to market their products in our way, which will increase marginal costs.
And here we are, 7 years later, and the government is refusing to do the one thing that their entire existence is based on because, surprise, surprise, it would increase costs. And if you need a reminder about why this government even exists and the circumstances that gave it power in the first place, here's Boris Johnson announcing the election in 2019.
No one much wants to have an election in December, but we've got to the stage where we have no choice because our parliament is paralysed, it's been stuck in a rut for 3.5 years.
But why was Parliament stuck for 3 years? Because Boris Johnson got people to vote for Brexit based on 2 incompatible promises. 1, that we would no longer follow EU rules, and 2, that our economy would thrive. And given that our economy depends on frictionless trade with the EU, those promises don't work together, and yet Boris Johnson left Theresa May to clean up his mess.
I also think that this delay is now bad for the country and for the economy, and with every week that goes by, uncertainty is deterring people from hiring new staff, from buying new homes, from making new investments.
Which is what is still happening right now. The Tories delaying the full implementation of Brexit 5 times means that businesses don't have any certainty, as they discussed on Newsnight.
It's going to become even harder to get businesses to prepare for the next iteration, for the next deadline, because they've been marched up this hill so many times that they might just think, well, I'm not going to prepare.
Come with us, get Brexit done, and take this country forward. Or, and this is the alternative next year, spend the whole of 2020 in a horror show of yet more dither and delay.
Yeah, all that dither and delay that he calls it, that's because politicians couldn't find a version of Brexit that works. And now it's been 7 years and they still can't. And yet he still attacks Labour's plan.
Another referendum on Brexit, which is meant to happen in 9 months' time.
So because Brexiteers hated Labour's version of Brexit, and they also hated Boris Johnson's as well,
Remain wins that referendum and wins it every single time.
which means that we would have actually been done with Brexit properly by September 2020, almost 3 years ago.
In any scenario, the dither and the drift and the delay, which is increasingly damaging for our country, would just continue. And we do know that there's only one way to avoid that nightmare, and that is to vote for a moderate and compassionate one nation Conservative government.
Are you starting to see how insane it is that they've delayed getting Brexit done 5 times now? Now, according to the government's documents, every load of goods that we import is going to be charged between £20 and £43 as an admin fee, which they say is about 0.13% of the total price of everything we import from the EU, and that the plan as a whole will increase food prices by 0.2%. And I'm just going to straight up call that bullshit. For starters, it literally says in the documents, costs will depend greatly on how businesses adapt their business models and supply chains to integrate the new controls regimes. Because this document reads to me like, hey, we've worked out the absolute bare minimum this could cost businesses by basically rounding up from the 0.13% tariff that we're charging them. All the paperwork you'll have to do, all the staffing hours you'll have to pay for to cover that bureaucracy, that's on you. Survive or die. And as we've already seen when the export checks started, it's the smallest companies that suffer the most from that. But they will get the blame when they can't afford the extra costs, and Jacob Rees-Mogg proves that.
How is Brexit going, though? Some people would point to the value of the pound falling against the euro and the dollar, consumer confidence falling, problems with housing, various other issues, all fueled by Brexit. What is the reality?
If you heard Sir James Dyson on the radio earlier today, he was so positive about how his business is doing. Some businesses that for other reasons have not been doing well like to blame Brexit, but that's actually an excuse of poor management.
The Tories are setting businesses up to take the blame for the damage that they're about to do to them. And another reason why a 0.2% increase is total bullshit? Again, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
You're admitting that this could save £1 billion, which means that checks would have cost £1 billion. I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm if we'd gone ahead with it. It would have increased costs for people. Some costs, it would be quite significant. That if you look at small deliveries of things like cheese, you were talking about 71% increase maximum level on the retail price. And frankly, at that level, goods just wouldn't have come in.
Not to mention, the Bank of England has already said that Brexit, even without the checks on incoming food, has raised food prices by 6%. So the idea that an effective tariff on most of our incoming food would do less than that makes zero sense to me.
Sorry, I forgot to add. If we get to January and they delay it again, you know that they know they're talking out their ass, because there's no way they'd risk that kind of humiliation to avoid a 0.2% increase in prices.
So the Tories have nowhere to go. They either go into the next election having explicitly, publicly, and repeatedly chosen not to fulfill the main promise they made in the previous election, or they go into the next election while effectively starving their own voters during a poverty crisis by taking an axe to their food supply. And I would love to see a journalist actually give them that choice, but sadly...
We did invite the government on to discuss, but they declined.
Because they'd have nothing. You just have Mark Francois trying to headbutt Faisal Islam while screaming 2 world wars and 1 World Cup. And while I'm grateful that Faisal Islam and Newsnight covered this story, it needs to be talked about a hell of a lot more, so we need to make them talk about it. That means showing up to the National Rejoin March on Saturday the 23rd of September. There are free coaches available on the website. I'm Femi, have a great week.